And now I want to just turn to this because this is like the new drama that just popped up with Bernie Sanders at the New York Times. And let's just play these clips back to back because we'll start with Bernie and then we'll go to President Obama.
About the fact that Trump has touched a chord in 40 to 44% of the people. What about that issue? It's like Trump is a symptom of a widespread problem.
Yes.
So, I mean, how do you address that?
What is the issue? How did Trump become president? Not everybody, but tens and tens of millions of Americans feel that the political establishment, Republican and Democrat, have failed them. Maybe the New York Times has failed them too.
That explains the appeal of racism?
Yeah. People are, in many cases in this country, working longer hours for low wages. You are aware of the fact that in an unprecedented way, life expectancy is actually going down in America because of diseases of despair. People have lost hope, and they are drinking, they're doing drugs, they're committing suicide. And when that condition arises, whether it was the 1930s in Germany, then people are susceptible to the blame game, to say that it is the undocumented people in this country who are the cause of all of our problems. And if we just throw 10 million people out of the country, you're gonna have a good job, and you're gonna have good health care, and you have good education. That's all we gotta do. So all over the world, Trump didn't invent demagoguery. It's an age-old weapon, and you take a minority, and you demonize that minority, and you blame that minority, and you take the despair and the anger and the frustration that people are feeling, and you say that's the cause of your problem.
All right, so this was, I mean, this set off a whole chain reaction on Twitter. This was like, everybody had the whole, like, everybody was basically responding to that with the Hillary Clinton, bank regulation won't solve racism thing. But I just want to play President Obama back a couple years ago.
A suspicion of elites and governing institutions that people feel may not be responsive to their immediate needs. And that sometimes gets wrapped up in issues of ethnic identity or religious identity or cultural identity. And that can be a volatile mix. I think fear and anxiety in a lot of people, a sense that the economy wasn't as certain as it could be and maybe the game was rigged. President-elect Trump tapped into that particular strain within the Republican Party and then was able to broaden that enough and get enough votes to win the election. The lesson I draw, and I think people can draw a lot of lessons, but maybe one that cuts across countries, is we have to deal with issues like inequality. We have to deal with issues of economic dislocation. We have to deal with people's fears that their children won't do as well as they have. The more aggressively and effectively we deal with those issues, the less those fears may channel themselves into counterproductive approaches.
Well,
how dare he?
Yeah, I was going to say, well, first of all, obviously Obama canceled, but your first thoughts. I've got a bunch on this, so please go first.
Well, ever since 2016, there's been this, in my mind, very, very dumb debate over whether it was racism or economics that led to Trump, as if those things are just wholly unrelated. Right. And that's the thing is, you have to, of course, like, obviously racism is a real thing, but part of why the Democratic establishment and people like the New York Times, et cetera, love to just say, oh, well, this happened because voters are racist or they're sexist, et cetera, and just put it all on the voters are bad people and they're like, there's like, the deplorables, there's no hope for them, is because that keeps them from having to do any self-reflection about their own role in creating the conditions that led to Donald Trump. So if it's just the voters' fault, then I don't have to think about like the way that I championed these trade deals that destroyed parts of I don't have to think about how we had a massive, the worst addiction crisis in our nation's history on my watch. I don't have to think about the way that I bailed on the banks and didn't hold anyone accountable and left homeowners to just like lose everything, basically. I don't have to think about the structure of neoliberalism that led to a small slice of people doing incredibly well and the rest of America basically screwed. Like, I don't have to do any self-analysis about that if it's just the voters are racist and bad. And so I think that's why there's such an attachment and such a and people get so triggered when you suggest, these things go together. Like, just look at history. They go together. It's no accident that at times of massive inequality and massive, where you do have this sort of core rot where the values we've been sold that buying the next piece of cheap Chinese-made good is going to make us happy, like that thing has all fallen apart. And at times when you have that kind of dislocation, yes, ugliness comes out, viciousness comes out, demagogues come and seize on these ugly emotions. That's just a historical fact.
I have 4 quick things on this. I agree with you completely. But one, what drives me, number one is that this discourse is actually cheapening of the scale and the size of racism in American history too, right? Because it's like, if you want to just talk about the Republican Party, obviously white identity politics is a major part of the whole foundation of how this thing works.
Yes.
Ronald Reagan went to a town where civil rights workers were murdered to talk about states' rights, to launch a presidential campaign. Everybody knows what that means, unless you're an idiot. And then the second part that's really important. I've seen these 2 guys on Twitter, and I'm sure I'll apologize later at some future date. But as of now, there are these 2 brothers who love Elizabeth Warren, and they're much less fun than the Krasenstein brothers. And one of them was doing this really genius point that you can't talk about economics with regards to discussing racism because there are rich, racist white people. Now, I want to make, this is just, I don't know. This is like the stuff, honestly, I'll own my snobbery here. This stuff you take care of in a freshman year of political theory or conversation. Then it's like, how is it working in the different discourses? So there's a scapegoating discourse. Then there's a justification and hoarding discourse. And the interesting thing is that some of this, and it's not as destructive, obviously, as the white supremacy you'll see in the Republican Party, but there is a parallel with neoliberal woke scold politics because the same functionality, there's some new numbers that are really interesting, that some of the highest numbers in group dislike of each other is internal to white people. There's this big growth in white people hating each other because white people are constantly having drama and making everything about themselves. Because, look, you can't run this as a campaign, but I'll say it in a podcast. White people are fucking annoying. But we all know this. But the thing was really interesting was that what some of this research is pointing to is that important gains on understanding things like racism is not translating to a broader understanding of racism and class and inequality and all of these dynamics. It's turning into a certain group of upper middle class white people just creating another deserving poor for themselves. So instead of the racism that these people would have in the 90s of demonizing poor African Americans, now they're just demonizing white trash, they would say.
Yeah. And
so the point I'm making here is that the way that this discourse is starting to function for professional class Democrats is functionally getting very similar, because what it is functionally weaponized into is we're going to use it as a bludgeon against a redistribution candidate.
Right.
And in both cases, the rhetoric works, and I'm just talking how the rhetoric works. I'm not making equivalency for people who get all triggered, but the rhetoric works in both cases to negate the forward motion of actual material redistribution. And that is why the functionality of those discourses run in tandem. And the third thing that the sad Krasenstein guy was saying, I don't remember their names. And the third thing is that several years ago, this point that President Obama was making was totally non-controversial. Anybody could observe it. It's obvious. There's endless empirical data. Just as some people could absolutely point that there is racism that is dislocated, and has its own trajectory, no doubt.
Right.
But at the same time, if you go and you read any ethnographic study of why somebody becomes a neo-Nazi or gets drawn to a racist coalition, or a terrorist for that matter,
Yep.
there is always these types of issues. And by the way, the last thing I'll say, not just economic deprivation. It's also sense of lack of purpose, sense of lack of social meaning. What's really funny is I feel like sometimes now with some of these woke people, it's like talking to a right-wing person talking about Islamic terrorism, because the point was never to justify Islamic terrorism or say it wasn't a threat or say it wasn't totally disgusting, but it was to say, you need to contextualize where these things are coming from. If it's just a metaphysical force, then there's nothing that can be done about it. And then, of course, as Adolf Reed says, well, right, then it does become a metaphysical force and we won't do anything about it.
Right.
You can perform on Twitter and then, all of a sudden people still don't have health care. All of a sudden we're still not doing anything about housing.
Well, to tie it back directly to the Elizabeth Warren flap, it's the type of politics that would say whether Bernie Sanders was woke enough in a private conversation with Elizabeth Warren over a year ago is more important than his record, than what he would do on the issues, than the substantive policy differences between all the candidates, like that it would privilege that conversation. And whether he was perfectly PC,
Yep.
like even in a private conversation one-on-one, that's more important than those substantive issues. Like that is the politics of the mainstream of the Democratic Party today. And it's no accident that as the party has been intentionally centered more around the professional managerial class, that's the politics that you get. Because that allows you to say, like, to signal your virtue, and I'm a good person, and I'm not racist, and I'm for the good fight, and I'm for progress, et cetera, without actually having any threat to your own material well-being, your own status in the hierarchy. So it's a very safe politics for, the people who are in the New York Times editorial board, or who are performatively woke on Twitter, or who disproportionately make up the coalitions of Pete and Warren, et cetera, et cetera.
And that's also how you could say, like, Pete actually saying, like, the founding fathers didn't even know slavery was wrong. Like, what's amazing is that what goes along with it, not to interrupt, is actually an incredible lack of realness about just how racist this country can be from like actual historical perspective, not just like figuring out certain ways of signifying yourself on Twitter or in your campaign, because everything is offloaded to Trump or now Bernie, even more dementedly. You don't have to deal with anything.
Right.
It's just like, there was a time it was bad. Now there's Trump.
Right.
I used the right terminology, right? Okay, great. Right. I don't have to raise my taxes. Awesome.
I don't have to raise my taxes. I don't have to think about my complicity in creating this situation. And there's another piece of this too, though, which is that in the modern era, in the past, past 30 years, let's say, basically the Democrats and Republicans, they've both bought into this idea of the goal of the perfect meritocracy, right? That if we can just have a system that functions where the brilliant little Barack Obamas can ascend to their rightful place in the meritocracy, then all will be well. And functionally, the only difference between the two parties was that Republicans were like, the meritocracy is already perfect, so no worries. There's no racism anymore. There's no sexism anymore. We're all good to go. And the Democrats were like, no, the meritocracy would be perfect, but we just need to deal with racism, sexism, like as these sort of isolated items that we need to excise from the hearts of Americans. And so if you look at poor white people, poor white men in particular, and you're a Democrat and you buy into this nonsense about the meritocracy and how the only barriers are like race, gender, religion, et cetera, you've got the list of appropriate excuses for why people are doing well, right? And you look at this group that's not doing well and you've got no reason. You're like, you don't have a systemic critique that says, oh, well, this whole thing is rotten to its core.
Right.
And so, of course, people suffer across race, gender, religious lines. And this group of white men and women are part of the groups that are suffering under this rotten system. So instead, you have to say, well, you have to look at them with contempt. I mean, there's nothing else, and you can say,
Yeah, Lula didn't say like people of Italian descent in the favela are privileged.
Right, exactly. Like you can't, and that is what we heard a lot in the run up to Trump is like, oh well, these white working class people, they have white privilege, so in our hierarchy they don't rank, and they must be flawed on some fundamental level as human beings because this whole system supposedly in this framework is set up for them to succeed. They're not succeeding, so it's on them.
And that is a purely reactionary narrative. Like that's what I really want to underscore. Like that's the whole point of Adolph Reed. That's what, like when we talked on the show a couple months ago, I was like, look, you wrote about this stuff, you read like the New Republic in the 90s. It's all, ironically, the same people that would be supporting Warren and Pete today writing these disgusting racist narratives about there's poverty in the inner city because of rap music. I mean, literally, like just this kind of garbage versus like racism and economic theft and deindustrialization. And now you get the woke version of like, and it's not to say that like, look, people, there's problems, there's flaws, things are complex, blah, blah, blah. But if you go to some bombed out deindustrialized place in like West Virginia and you show up and you're just like, these people have toxic masculinity. And if that is the guiding part of your analysis, you're a fucking idiot. And you are like you're reactionary. You're making a moralistic argument about people who have been materially devastated. And that's the engine of my politics. And I apparently that bothers some people, but that's how I look at things.
Yeah.
That was why I was always appalled and disgusted by those same narratives about race, frankly. And I'm not going to, I don't have like a loophole when it comes to other areas of the economy. Of course, relatively, like, would you pick being a working class poor white man versus a working class poor Mexican woman? Obviously, there is, of course, relative privilege disparities there.
Of course.
But on the broader section of like the economy and how it functions, I mean, no, I'm not making moral narratives about groups. I'm talking about how the fucking economy works.
That was one of the things that really sort of broke my relationship with the Democratic Party is when I was living in Kentucky, and, I've done lots of work in West Virginia as well. And I would, tweet out something about something important that was going on there, an election that was lost, that was significant, that was going to impact people's lives, or, some a health outcome that was just anything that was going on there. And what I would get back is like, oh, well, screw those people. Who cares? It's like, I did not sign up to belong to a party that would pick and choose who was worthy of their empathy and who wasn't. Like who we want to help and who we exclude because we've cast some moral judgment upon them. I mean, think about the insanity of this, right? We are rightfully so the party that talks about criminal justice reform and giving people a second chance. Like people have committed horrific crimes and we still believe like these are human beings and they deserve to vote, they deserve to be members of society, et cetera, et cetera.
To fully have a life.
To fully have a life.
Absolutely.
And yet on the other hand, you're going to look at someone who's struggling in West Virginia who, doesn't know all the right woke or PC language or genuinely holds views that are unacceptable and abhorrent and toxic masculinity and all of that. Like, I'm not saying that's okay, but you're willing to forgive the formerly incarcerated person. You're not willing to forgive that person or give them a second chance. That doesn't make any kind of sense to me whatsoever. Plus, what does that lead to? Like, how does it even make coherent sense as a party to say, we want to help this group, we don't want to help that group, we're going to look at this working class and break it into, demographics and go after certain ones of them? That's how you end up with the kind of shallow identity politics that just focuses on like microaggressions as the end all be all of what you want to do for people.
Right.
It is almost exactly the flip of what the Republicans do. I mean, Republicans pander on culture, on white identity culture, and it's been very successful. And that has kept them from from having to respond to the actual economic interests and needs of their coalition by signaling on white identity culture. Democrats basically do the same thing. Rather than actually responding to the material interests of their multiracial working class, like black and brown working class coalition, instead, they're basically like, well, we're not racist. So you have to be with
And
us.
as we always say, it's like, look, it's like if the two options are white supremacy capitalism versus like diversity capitalism, we will
course,
pick diversity But I
capitalism.
think we'd like to actually aim a little bit higher.
Right.
We'd actually like to provide some like broad human decency. And I think, I mean, you're 100% right. And the other thing too that also strikes me is like, if you're just doing that brokerage model of politics, you are going to have an innate limit on how broadly you can build that coalition.
Of course.
And it's also going to get opportunistically flipped, right? Like, that's another thing about, I have no problem saying that Trump absolutely, of course, a major part of what he did was racism and xenophobia. Anybody who would deny that is denying reality. But he also upped his margins, relatively speaking, with Hispanic voters and with African-American voters. And that is all purely jobs and corruption rhetoric.
Right.
So you have to take it all on. And I just, I think that this game with Bernie just really distills everything.
My aspirations for this nation are greater than changing the gender ratio of our oppressors. Like, I dream bigger than that,
I think you could dream
right?
slightly bigger than that.
If those are my only options, like you said, yes, I'd like to have more women and more people of color in the, oppression class. But I would rather.
It was a bisexual woman that actually wrote the Supreme Court decision that reformalized indentured servitude for student loans.
Slay queen.
Yeah, slay queen. If the Republicans run a woman in 2024, I guess we shouldn't even run a candidate.
Yeah, let's get Sarah Palin back, right?
Well, I mean, when you think about the incredible microaggression of Barack Obama and Joe Biden running against her, it really makes you rethink a lot of
So
stuff.
wrong.
It's disgusting.
How could they?
How could they do
Who was
that?
it that put out that tweet that was like, well, one way Bernie could prove he's not sexist by not running against a woman. It's like
Matthew Dowd, who literally was a propaganda architect of the invasion of Iraq. I mean, that's what I love about it. It's like you can't even just, at least those sad Krasenstein brothers are like just, some goofy guys that like Elizabeth Warren. But now it's like we have people who have actually, like, I'm Mr. Forgive, rehabilitate, people are complicated.
Yeah.
But you have people coming out of the woodwork who have done maybe some of the only things that were just like, you know what, you help propagandize an effort that murdered like over 1 million people. You probably should be like, you should be a Nick Nolte character, growing a beard, feeling guilty somewhere in the country. Like, I didn't know what I was doing. You should not be on ABC News opining about anything.
Or how about all the people who've been hired at MSNBC, national security state apparatchiks who are now like Trump resistance warriors and heroes? I mean, this is where, and that's where like the danger of that type of politics and the subsuming of those. MSNBC, my former employer, they literally found their identity in opposition to the Iraq War, right? That was the galvanizing thing. And look, this is a capitalistic enterprise. They saw Keith Olbermann's show was doing that and it worked. And so they just kept going from there. Now it's come full circle with the very people they were opposing are like now celebrated and on the payroll, et cetera, et cetera. But that, again, leads you to a politics. These are Republicans. Like, they're not your allies, but it leads you to a politics that focuses on this, like, civility and word policing. And, the worst we could say about Donald Trump is that he's broken the norms and guardrails.
Which is, like, the only good thing you could say about him.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
Like that awesome, like, I just got impeached for making the perfect phone call.
Right. That's
if politics was all just that stuff, I would be a Republican because he's funny.
That's also like,
just kidding.
That's also like, that's the core of these people's politics, and it's their key to their paycheck too. Right. It's the key to them maintaining their status in the power structure. That's why so many of these never Trump Republicans are so mad is because they don't have power and purchase and the gig flow that they used to have in the town. That's the real thing.
Absolutely. Let's
don't have principles. It's not about that.
Of course not. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.